It was a spring afternoon in Madrid. The sun was streaming through the windows of my small apartment in the Lavapiés neighborhood. I, Anna, a 32-year-old primary school teacher, was enjoying a well-deserved rest after an exhausting week at school. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee filled the air as I absent-mindedly leafed through a decorating magazine, imagining how I could give a more cozy touch to our home. Carlos, my husband, had left early to play paddle tennis with his friends, like every Saturday. Our routine was simple but satisfying, him with his morning games and me with my quiet moments at home. We had been married for 3 years and, despite the normal ups and downs of any marriage, we were happy. However, there was a shadow that loomed over our happiness, my mother-in-law, Donna Carmen. From the beginning, our relationship had been strained. She never hid her disapproval of me, considering me unrefined for her son. Carlos always tried to mediate between us, but it was evident that the situation caused him great stress. The doorbell rang, breaking me out of my thoughts. I looked at the clock, 4:30 p.m. I wasn't expecting visitors and Carlos wouldn't be back until the evening. With some curiosity, I approached the door and looked through the peephole. To my surprise, it was Donna Carmen, impeccably dressed as always, with her signature pearl necklace and a designer bag. I took a deep breath, mentally preparing myself for the encounter. I opened the door with the best smile I could muster. "Good afternoon, Donna Carmen. What a surprise to see you here," I said, trying to sound as friendly as possible. "Good afternoon, Anna," he responded with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I was passing through the neighborhood and thought I'd pay you a visit. Is Carlos here?" "I'm sorry, he's out playing paddle tennis with his friends. He won't be back until tonight," I explained, noticing a flash of disappointment in his eyes. "Oh, wow. What a shame," he said, and then, after an awkward pause, he added, "Well, since I'm here, do you mind if I stop by for a moment? I brought something special." Before I could respond, Donna Carmen was already entering the apartment, with sure and determined steps. I followed her into the living room, where she set her purse on the table and pulled out a thermos. "I've made a special coffee," he announced in a tone that was trying to be sweet. "It's a family recipe. I thought you might like to try it." I was momentarily speechless. This gesture was completely unexpected coming from her. Was he trying to make peace? "Wow, thank you very much, Donna Carmen. You didn't have to bother," I responded, still surprised. "It's not a bother, dear. Come on, sit down, I'll serve it to you." I obeyed, watching as my mother-in-law moved around the kitchen familiarly, searching for cups and spoons. Meanwhile, my mind was spinning. What had caused this sudden change? Should I trust her? Donna Carmen returned with 2 steaming cups. He offered me one and sat in front of me, looking at me expectantly. "Go on, try it. I'm sure you'll love it," she encouraged me with a smile that seemed forced to me. I took the cup and inhaled the aroma. It smelled good, although there was something different, a touch I couldn't identify. I took a small sip, feeling the hot liquid in my mouth. The flavor was intense, with a bitter aftertaste that I found strange. "That's interesting," I commented, not sure what to say. "It has a very peculiar flavor. It's because of the spices I add," Donna Carmen explained, without touching her own cup. "It's a family secret." We continued talking, or rather, she talked and I nodded, taking small sips of the coffee out of politeness. She told me about her travel plans, her meetings with friends from the bridge club, and other banalities she wouldn't normally share with me. As the minutes passed, I began to feel strange. My head was heavy and my vision was blurry at times. Donna Carmen's words began to sound distant, as if she were speaking from the bottom of a tunnel. "Are you okay, Anna? You're a little pale," I heard him say, but his voice sounded distorted. I tried to respond, but my tongue felt heavy and clumsy. The world around me began to spin and I grabbed the edge of the couch to keep from falling. I don't feel good," I managed to articulate before everything became a blur. The last thing I remember clearly is Dona Carmen's expression. He no longer feigned concern. There was a mixture of satisfaction and relief on his face, as if he had completed an unpleasant but necessary task. Then everything went black. When I regained consciousness, the first thing I felt was movement. A rhythmic clatter and the murmur of unknown voices. I opened my eyes slowly, blinking several times to focus. I was in a train car, surrounded by people I didn't know. Confusion and panic took over me. Where was it? How had he gotten there? I tried to get up, but a wave of dizziness forced me to sit back down. My head throbbed as if it had a life of its own. "Excuse me," I said to the woman sitting next to me, an older lady who was looking at me curiously. "Can you tell me where this train is going?" The woman frowned. "To Barcelona, of course." "Are you okay, young lady?" Barcelona. It was hundreds of kilometers from Madrid. The panic increased. I frantically searched my pockets, but couldn't find my phone or wallet. Nothing. I was completely lost and without resources. The memories of what happened in my apartment slowly began to return. Dona Carmen's coffee, the strange taste, the dizziness. And then, nothing. What had he done to me? How was it possible that he had put me on a train to Barcelona? Questions raced through my mind, but I had no answers. He only knew that he had to return to Madrid, find Carlos and face his mother. But how? No money, no identification, no way to communicate. The train continued on its way, taking me further and further away from my home, from my life. I looked out the window, watching the landscape speed by, feeling like my world was falling apart with every kilometer we advanced. I didn't know what awaited me at the end of this journey, but I was sure of one thing: my life had changed forever, and I would have to fight with all my might to get it back. The train screeched to a stop at Barcelona Sant Station. The metallic voice from the loudspeaker announced the end of the journey, snapping me out of my daze. Still disoriented, I staggered to my feet and followed the river of passengers heading toward the exit. The bustle of the station hit me like a wave, the noise of suitcases rolling, conversations in Catalan and Spanish, constant announcements over the public address system. I felt small, insignificant and completely lost. Not knowing what to do, I sat on a nearby bench, trying to gather my thoughts. The station clock read 8:15 p.m. More than 24 hours had passed since I had that damn coffee in my apartment in Madrid. What was Carlos thinking? Had he already noticed my disappearance? The image of my husband, worried and confused, brought a lump to my throat. I took a deep breath, trying to control the panic that threatened to take over me. I needed a plan. The first thing was to find help, explain my situation to someone who could contact Carlos or the police in Madrid. I got up and approached a security guard patrolling the station. "Excuse me," I said with a shaky voice. "I need help." "They have. I think they have kidnapped me and abandoned me here. I have no money or documentation." The guard looked at me with a mixture of suspicion and annoyance. "Madam, if you need social help, you should go to the social services at the town hall. We can't do anything for you here." "No, he doesn't understand," I insisted, feeling tears begin to form in my eyes. "I'm from Madrid, my mother-in-law drugged me and—" "Look," the guard interrupted me, visibly uncomfortable. "If you have been a victim of a crime, you must file a report at the police station. But without documentation, I can't do anything. I'm sorry." And with that, he walked away, leaving me standing there, with the word in my mouth and my heart heavy. I realized then that no one was going to believe my story. Without evidence, without documents, she was just another woman with an unlikely story. I left the station, facing the unknown streets of Barcelona. The fresh night air hit my face, bringing with it the aroma of the sea mixed with the smell of food from the nearby restaurants. My stomach growled, reminding me that I hadn't eaten anything all day. I walked aimlessly, watching the people passing by me, absorbed in their own lives. Couples laughing, tourists consulting maps, workers returning home after a long day. Everyone had somewhere to go, except me. After several hours of wandering, fatigue and hunger got the best of me. I sat on a bench in Plaça de Catalunya, watching the city begin to sleep. The pigeons swarmed at my feet, waiting for crumbs that I didn't have to give them. I felt as lost as them, looking for scraps to survive. That night I slept on that same bench, curled up and shivering from the cold, using my jacket as a makeshift blanket. The noise of the traffic and the conversations of night passers-by kept me in a restless sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Dona Carmen's face, with that satisfied smile that she had sketched just before she lost consciousness. At dawn, I woke up to the noise of street sweepers and the hustle and bustle of the city coming back to life. I got up, sore and numb, not knowing what to do or where to go. Hunger was already a dull pain in my stomach, and thirst burned my throat. I started walking again, this time with one goal in mind: find food. I approached several bakeries, attracted by the smell of freshly baked bread, but could only look longingly through the windows. In a moment of desperation, I considered stealing a loaf of bread, but fear of arrest stopped me. If he ended up in jail, how could he return home? Finally, luck smiled a little on me. In a square, I saw a group of tourists leaving remains of sandwiches and fruits on a bench. I waited for them to walk away and, swallowing my pride and shame, I picked up what they had left behind. A piece of stale bread and a nibbled apple have never tasted so good to me. The next few days became a survival routine. I learned to move around the city, to find safe places to sleep, doorways of buildings, quiet parks, even the occasional church that stayed open at night. I discovered that the trash cans of certain restaurants were a reliable source of still edible food, although I had to overcome the initial disgust and fear of being discovered. One morning, while I was rummaging through a container behind a restaurant in the Gothic Quarter, I heard a voice behind me. "Hey, you! What are you doing there?" I turned around, scared, to see an older man, probably the owner of the place. I prepared to flee, but something in his gaze stopped me. There was no anger, but a mixture of curiosity and compassion. I'm sorry," I stammered. "I was hungry and..." The man sighed, looked me up and down, and then said, "Come with me." I followed him cautiously to the restaurant kitchen. There, to my surprise, he served me a plate of leftovers from the day before, paella, some bread and a glass of water. "Eat," he told me simply. While I was devouring the food, the man, who introduced himself as Jordi, asked me about my story. For the first time since I arrived in Barcelona, someone seemed willing to listen to me. I told him everything: the poisoned coffee, waking up on the train, my days wandering the streets. Jordi listened in silence, nodding from time to time. "Look," he said to me when I finished my story. "I can't offer you much, but if you want, you can come here every morning. I'll give you yesterday's leftovers in exchange for you helping me clean up a little." Tears of gratitude escaped me without being able to stop them. "Thank you," was all I could say. Thus began a new stage in my Barcelona odyssey. Every morning, before the restaurant opened, I arrived to help Jordi. I swept, washed dishes, peeled potatoes. In exchange, I was guaranteed at least one meal a day and a little money that Jordi gave me, just in case. With a full stomach and a clearer mind, I was able to start thinking about how to return to Madrid. I saved every penny Jordi gave me, dreaming of the day I could buy a bus ticket back home. However, life on the street was still hard. The nights were cold, and I often woke up shivering, longing for the warmth of my bed in Madrid. The loneliness was overwhelming. Despite Jordi's kindness, she was still a stranger in an unfamiliar city, with no one to really turn to. One night, while I was dozing in a corner of the Parc de la Ciutadella, I was rudely awakened by a group of drunk young people. They laughed at me, called me a beggar and a crazy, and one of them even tried to take my jacket. I ran away from there, with my heart beating 1,000 miles an hour, and I didn't stop until I reached the other side of the city. That incident made me realize how vulnerable I was. I needed to find a safer place to sleep. That's when I discovered homeless shelters. At first, I resisted the idea. Going to a shelter meant admitting that I had truly become homeless. But the cold and fear got the better of my pride. The first hostel I went to was full, but they gave me the address of another one in the Ravol neighborhood. There, finally, I was able to sleep in a real bed, even if it was in a room shared with 10 other women. The noise of snoring and muffled sobs kept me awake, but at least I was safe and warm. At the shelter I met Elena, a woman in her 50s who had been living on the streets for years. It was she who taught me the tricks to survival, where to get second-hand clothes, how to avoid pickpockets, which soup kitchens had the best food. The most important thing, he told me one night as we shared a cigarette outside the shelter, is not to lose hope. The moment you give up, you're lost. His words stuck with me. Despite everything, I had something that many there did not have, a home to return to, a life to recover. That gave me strength to move forward. Days turned into weeks, and weeks into months. Little by little, I was recovering fragments of my memory that the initial shock had blocked. I remembered the name of the school where I worked, Carlos's phone number, the address of our apartment in Madrid. Every night before going to sleep, I reviewed these facts like a mantra, fearing I would forget them again. One afternoon, while helping Jordi in the restaurant, I saw a report on television about missing people. My heart skipped a beat when I saw a photo of myself on the screen. Carlos was there, talking to the journalist, with a haggard face and tired eyes. "Ana, if you're watching this, please come home. We're looking for you. I love you," he said, looking directly into the camera. I burst into tears right there, in the middle of the kitchen. Jordi hugged me, allowing me to vent on his shoulder. "You have to come back," he told me when I calmed down. "Your husband is waiting for you." That night, at the shelter, I made a decision. I had saved enough for a bus ticket to Madrid, but I was still afraid of facing Dona Carmen and the consequences of my disappearance. What if no one believed me? What if Carlos didn't love me anymore after so long? Elena, my friend from the hostel, listened patiently as I told her my fears. "Look, girl," he told me with his characteristic directness. "You have survived months on the streets. You have been hungry, cold and afraid. Are you really going to let fear stop you from returning to your life? You are stronger than you think." His words gave me the push I needed. The next morning, I said goodbye to Jordi, promising that I would return all his help one day. I bought a bus ticket to Madrid and, with my heart in my mouth, I got on the vehicle that would take me back home. During the trip, my mind kept spinning. How would Carlos react when he saw me? Would you believe me when I told you what had happened? How would you face Dona Carmen? Anxiety and excitement mixed inside me, creating a cocktail of emotions that kept me on the edge of my seat. As the bus passed through the changing landscapes of Spain, from the fields of Catalonia to the plains of Castile, I felt like I was closing a chapter of my life. The months in Barcelona, with all its difficulties and moments of despair, had changed me. She was no longer the same Ana who had involuntarily left Madrid. She was stronger, more resilient, but also more cautious and distrustful. As we approached Madrid, the nerves intensified. He recognized the places, the roads, the buildings. Every kilometer brought me closer to my previous life, but also to the uncertainty of what awaited me. Finally, the bus entered Madrid's South Station. With shaky legs, I got out of the vehicle and put my feet on the ground of my city. I was at home, but at the same time, I felt like a stranger. 7 months had passed. 7 months of absence, of fight, of survival. I took a deep breath, grabbed the small bag with my few belongings and took the first step towards my new life. I didn't know what the future would bring, but I was determined to face it. He had survived the streets of Barcelona, he had kept hope alive in the darkest moments. Now was the time to claim my life, to demand answers and to fight for my happiness. With determination, I left the station and headed towards the subway. It was time to return home, to face Dona Carmen and to find Carlos. The real battle was about to begin. The sun was beginning to set when I arrived in Tarifa, a small coastal city in the far south of Spain. I had traveled for days, hitchhiking and sleeping wherever I could, always afraid that someone would recognize me or that the police would stop me. My disheveled appearance and lack of documentation made me a suspicious person in the eyes of many. The Strait of Gibraltar stretched out in front of me, its turquoise waters reflecting the last rays of the sun. In the distance, I could make out the silhouette of Africa, so close and yet so unreachable. I sat on the beach, feeling the cold sand under my bare feet, and for the first time in weeks, I allowed myself to cry. I cried for everything I had lost, my home, my job, my identity. I cried for Carlos, imagining him worried, searching for me tirelessly. And I cried for myself, for the woman I had been and who now seemed so far away. As tears ran down my cheeks, a soft voice startled me. "Are you okay, daughter?" I looked up to see an older woman with gray hair and kind eyes. She carried a wicker basket full of shells and colored stones. I don't know," I answered honestly, wiping away my tears with the back of my hand. The woman sat next to me, leaving the basket between us. "My name is Esperanza," she said with a warm smile. "And you seem to need a little hope in your life." I couldn't help but let out a bitter laugh. "Hope, what a fitting name. Tell me, what brings you to Tarifa with that lost face?" he asked, while his wrinkled fingers played with the shells of the basket. I hesitated for a moment. I had learned to distrust everyone during my months on the street. But something in Esperanza's gaze inspired confidence in me. Maybe it was his name, or maybe the fact that he had nothing left to lose. I told him my story, from the poisoned coffee to my trip through Spain. Esperanza listened silently, nodding from time to time, her eyes never leaving mine. When I finished, the sun had already completely set and the first stars were beginning to shine in the night sky. "Oh, daughter," Esperanza sighed. "You've been through a lot. But you're here, right? That's already a victory." He took a shell out of the basket and handed it to me. It was a small conch shell, pearly white with pink veins. "Here," he said. "When life hits you, sometimes the only thing you can do is hold on to something beautiful and hope the storm passes." I caressed the smooth surface of the shell, feeling its coolness against my skin. "Thank you," I murmured, not knowing what else to say. "Come with me," Esperanza said, standing up with surprising agility for her age. "I have a small shop in the village. You can spend the night there and tomorrow we will see what can be done." I followed her through the cobblestone streets of Tarifa, passing whitewashed houses and small bars where fishermen shared their stories of the day. Esperanza's store was a small shop on a corner, full of crafts, shells and precious stones. "It's not much," he said as he opened the door, "but it's a roof and you'll be safe." That night, I slept on a small cot in the back room, surrounded by the smell of incense and sea salt. For the first time in months, I felt safe. The next morning, Esperanza woke me up to the aroma of freshly brewed coffee and toast. "Eat," he said, placing a plate in front of me. "You need strength." While we were having breakfast, Esperanza explained to me that she needed help in the store. "I can't pay you much," he said, "but you will have a place to sleep and food on the table. And you will be able to save something for your trip back to Madrid." I accepted without hesitation. It was more than he had had in months. The days in Tarifa turned into weeks, and the weeks into months. He worked at Esperanza's store, serving tourists and locals alike. I learned to distinguish the different types of shells, to polish semi-precious stones, to create small jewelry with natural materials. Esperanza became my confidant, my teacher and, in many ways, the mother I never had. At night, sitting on the beach, she told me stories of her youth, of loves lost and found, of trips to distant lands. "Life is like the sea, Anna," he told me one night while we were watching the waves. "Sometimes calm, sometimes stormy. But always moving, always changing. Little by little, I began to recover fragments of my memory that the trauma had blocked. I remembered the name of the school where I worked in Madrid, the exact address of our apartment, Carlos's phone number. Every night before going to sleep, I reviewed these facts like a mantra, fearing I would forget them again. One afternoon, while I was organizing a new shipment of stones at the store, a group of tourists entered. Among them, a woman with a baby in her arms caught my attention. The boy played with a keychain that had a small replica of Madrid's Puerta del Sol. Seeing it triggered an avalanche of memories. Carlos and I, walking through the Plaza Mayor on our first date. Our first kiss in front of the bear and the strawberry tree. The night he proposed to me at the Temple of Dibod. Tears began to flow down my cheeks without me being able to stop them. Esperanza, noticing my state, approached and hugged me in silence. That night, sitting in the back room with a cup of hot tea, I told Esperanza about my recovered memories. "I think it's time for you to come home, daughter," he said with a mixture of sadness and determination. "You have healed a lot here, but your real life awaits you in Madrid." I knew he was right, but the thought of facing my past terrified me. What if Carlos doesn't love me anymore? What if he doesn't believe me when I tell him what happened? I asked, giving voice to my deepest fears. Esperanza took my hands in hers. "Ana, you have survived months on the streets. You have faced hunger, cold and loneliness. You are stronger than you think. And if your Carlos loves you as much as you say, he will listen to you." We spent the next few days preparing for my return trip. Esperanza insisted on giving me enough money for a bus ticket to Madrid and something extra, for emergencies. He gave me new clothes and a small suitcase to carry my few belongings. The night before my departure, Esperanza took me to the beach. He took out of his pocket the small conch shell that he had given me the day we met. "I want you to take it with you," he said, putting it in my hand. "So that you remember that there is always hope, even in the darkest of times." We embraced under the stars, the waves of the Strait of Gibraltar whispering at our feet. "Thank you for everything," I said through tears. "I can never repay you for what you have done for me." Esperanza pulled away and looked me in the eyes. "All I want is for you to be happy, daughter. And for you to never forget your inner strength." The next morning, with a heart full of gratitude and fear in equal measure, I boarded the bus that would take me back to Madrid. As Tarifa receded into the distance, I clutched the conch in my hand, promising myself that no matter what happened, I would never forget the lessons learned in this small coastal town. The trip to Madrid was long and full of anxiety. Every kilometer that brought us closer to the capital made my heart beat faster. I looked out the window, watching the landscape change, the olive groves of Andalusia giving way to the plains of La Mancha, and finally, the buildings on the outskirts of Madrid. During the ride, my mind didn't stop spinning. How would Carlos react when he saw me? Would you even recognize me? 7 months had passed, and I had changed so much, not only physically but also inside. And what would happen to Dona Carmen? The idea of facing her caused me a mixture of fear and anger. When the bus entered the South Station in Madrid, I felt my stomach contract. I climbed down on shaky legs, clinging to my small suitcase like it was a life preserver. The bustle of the station overwhelmed me, the noise, the people in a hurry, the announcements over the public address system. After months in quiet Tarifa, Madrid seemed like a completely different world. I sat on a bench, trying to calm my nerves and decide my next move. I took out the conch that Esperanza had given me and caressed it, seeking comfort in its smooth surface. "There is always hope," I repeated to myself, remembering my friend's words. Finally, I gathered enough courage to head to a phone booth. With trembling hands, I dialed our apartment number. My heart was beating so hard I thought it would burst out of my chest as I listened to the ringtone. 1, 2, 3 tones, and then, Carlos's voice. "Say." I was paralyzed. After so long, hearing his voice was like an electric shock. The words stuck in my throat. "Hello. Is there anyone there? Carlos insisted. Carlos. I finally managed to say, with a broken voice. It's me. Ana. There was a long silence, so long that for a moment I thought he had hung up. Anna. Her voice sounded incredulous, almost like a whisper. Is that really you? Oh my God, where are you? Are you okay? Tears began to run down my cheeks. I'm at South Station. Carlos, so much has happened. I don't even know where to start. Don't move from there, he said urgently. I'm going there right now. My God, Ana, I've been looking for you everywhere. I thought I'd lost you forever. I hung up the phone and returned to the bank, feeling like I was in a dream. Half an hour later, I saw Carlos running into the station. Our eyes met and the world seemed to stop. He approached slowly, as if afraid he would disappear if he moved too fast. When he was in front of me, he reached out with a trembling hand and touched my cheek. It's you, he said in a broken voice. It's really you. We embraced each other, crying and laughing at the same time. We didn't care about the people staring at us, the noise from the station, anything. At that time, there were only the two of us. When we finally separated, Carlos looked me up and down, noticing my changes. What happened to you, Ana? Where have you been all this time? I took a breath, preparing to tell my story. It's a long story, Carlos. And you won't believe how it all started. We sat in a cafeteria at the station and, for the next few hours, I told him everything. The poisoned coffee, waking up on the train, the months on the street, my time in Tarifa with Esperanza. Carlos listened with a mixture of horror, disbelief and relief. Your mother. He said when I finished my story, his voice shaking with rage. How could he do something like that? I don't know, Carlos. But I need to face her. I need to know why she did it. Carlos nodded, squeezing my hand. We'll do it together. But first, let's go home. You need to rest. The trip to our apartment was surreal. The streets of Madrid, so familiar and at the same time so strange after so long. When we entered the apartment, I froze at the door. Everything was exactly as I remembered, as if time had not passed. I've kept everything the same, Carlos said, noticing my reaction. I never gave up hope that you would come back. That night, lying in our bed, with Carlos by my side, I felt like I had finally come home. But I knew this was just the beginning. There were still many unanswered questions, many wounds to heal. The next morning, after a restless night full of nightmares about trains and unknown streets, Carlos and I prepared to face Dona Carmen. The ride home was tense, neither of them knew what to expect. When Dona Carmen opened the door and saw me, her face paled as if she had seen a ghost. How is that possible? He stammered. We have to talk, Mom, Carlos said with a voice that brooked no reply. The bus moved along the highway, devouring kilometers under a sky that alternated between threatening clouds and patches of sun. I, Ana, was sitting by the window, looking lost at the changing landscape. Each turn of the wheels brought me closer to Madrid, to my home, to Carlos, and to the uncertainty that awaited me. The little money I had managed to save working for Jordi in Barcelona was barely enough for the bus ticket and a sandwich that now lay untouched on my knees. The knot in my stomach wouldn't allow me to eat. My mind was a whirlwind of unanswered questions and imaginary scenarios, each one more terrifying than the last. How would Carlos react when he saw me? Would you believe me when I told you about the poisoned coffee and the months wandering the streets of Barcelona? And what would he do with Dona Carmen? The thought of facing her sent shivers down my spine, but it also lit a spark of rage inside me. The man sitting next to me, an older man, in a worn-out baseball cap, looked at me curiously. First time in Madrid, young lady, he asked kindly. I shook my head, giving a sad smile. No, I'm coming home after a long time. Ah, so it's a happy trip, he commented, without realizing the emotional storm that was unleashed inside me. I hope so, I murmured, more to myself than to him. The rest of the trip passed in silence. I tried to sleep, but every time I closed my eyes, I saw Dona Carmen's face, with that satisfied smile that she showed just before she lost consciousness that fateful day. I wondered if he had felt remorse at some point during these months. Would he have confessed his crime to Carlos? Or would he continue to feign concern about my disappearance? When the bus entered the South Station in Madrid, my heart was beating so hard that I feared it would burst out of my chest. With shaky legs, I got out of the vehicle and put my feet on the ground of my city. The familiar bustle of the station surrounded me, the announcement of departures and arrivals over the public address system, the rattling of suitcases, conversations in various accents. For a moment, I was paralyzed. I was at home, but at the same time, I felt like a stranger. 7 months had passed. 7 months of absence, of fight, of survival. The Ana who involuntarily left Madrid no longer existed. In her place, I was, stronger, more cautious, but also more determined than ever. I took a deep breath and took the first step. I didn't have a concrete plan, but I knew I needed to go home. Our house. The apartment he shared with Carlos in the Lavapiés neighborhood. With the few euros I had left, I bought a metro ticket and immersed myself in the city's underground labyrinth. The subway ride was like a trip back in time. Each station brought back memories: Atocha, where Carlos and I used to meet to go to the Retiro on Sundays; Tirso de Molina, where we bought freshly made bread every morning; Lavapiés, our home. I surfaced in the Plaza de Lavapiés, flooded by a mix of emotions. The neighborhood remained the same multicultural hustle and bustle, the same smells of spices and coffee, the same graffiti on the walls. But I saw everything with new eyes, appreciating every detail as if it were the first time. I walked through the narrow streets, my heart pounding. As I approached our building, fear and anticipation grew inside me. What if Carlos no longer lived there? What if he had rebuilt his life, thinking I was dead? Finally, I reached the door of the building. My trembling hand reached for the third-floor doorbell, but I stopped inches from pressing it. Was I prepared for whatever awaited me on the other side? At this moment, the door opened. A neighbor was going out with her dog for the afternoon walk. He looked at me curiously, probably noticing my disheveled appearance and my bewildered expression. "Are you looking for someone?" Maya asked. "I lived here," I responded with a shaky voice. "In the third." The woman frowned, studying me more closely. Suddenly, his eyes widened. "My goodness. Ana? Is that you?" I nodded, feeling tears begin to form in my eyes. Good God. Carlos is going to go crazy. He's been like a lost soul since you disappeared. Come on, go up, go up. He's at home, I saw him arrive a while ago. With my heart beating a mile an hour, I went up the stairs. Each step was a challenge, my legs felt like lead. When I reached the third floor, I stood in front of the door, paralyzed. I could hear the TV on the other side. Carlos was there, just a few meters from me. I took a deep breath and rang the doorbell. The seconds it took for the door to open were eternal. And then, there he was. Carlos, my Carlos. Thinner, with pronounced dark circles under his eyes and a beard of several days. His eyes widened in disbelief. And, he whispered, as if he feared it was a hallucination. "Hello, Carlos," I managed to say before the tears started to fall. The next thing I knew, I was in his arms, crying and laughing at the same time. Carlos hugged me tightly, as if he was afraid I was going to disappear again. I could feel her own tears wetting my hair. "You're alive," he repeated over and over again, between sobs. "You're alive. You're back." I don't know how long we were like that, hugging on the doorstep. Finally, Carlos pulled away enough to look at my face, his hands cupping my cheeks. "Where have you been? What happened to you?" I thought I'd lost you forever. The concern and love in his voice completely disarmed me. How could I explain everything that had happened? How could I tell him that his own mother was responsible for my disappearance? It's a long story, I finally said. But first, can I come in? I need to sit down. Carlos nodded, suddenly realizing that we were still in the hallway. He guided me into the apartment, and the familiarity of the place hit me like a wave. Everything was exactly as I remembered, as if time had stopped in my absence. I sat on the couch, the same one where I had had that fateful coffee months ago. Carlos sat next to me, without letting go of my hand, as if he was afraid I would faint if he let me go. Anna, please tell me what happened. I've been going crazy these months. The police, the private detectives, no one could find a clue to your whereabouts. I took a deep breath, preparing to tell a story that I knew was going to be hard to believe. Carlos, what I'm going to tell you is going to sound incredible, but I swear it's the truth. The day I disappeared, your mother came to visit me. For the next hour, I told him everything. The poisoned coffee, waking up on the train to Barcelona, the months living on the streets, the fight to survive, and finally, the return trip. Carlos listened in silence, his expression turning from disbelief to horror and finally to anger. My mother did this to you? His voice trembled with suppressed rage. I nodded, feeling an enormous weight as I saw the pain in his eyes. I'm sorry, Carlos. I know it's hard to believe, but I swear it's the truth. Carlos jumped up, pacing the room like a caged lion. I always knew he didn't like you, but this is monstrous. How could he do this to us? To you? To me? Seeing him like this, so hurt and betrayed, broke my heart. I got up and hugged him, feeling how he was shaking with anger and pain. The important thing is that I'm here now, I said softly. We're together again. Carlos hugged me tightly, burying his face in my neck. I've missed you so much, Anna. Every day without you was torture. I never lost hope of finding you, but with each passing day. We stayed like that for a long time, hugging each other, comforting each other. Finally, Carlos pulled away, with a new determination in his eyes. We have to report it, he said. What he did is a serious crime. He can't get away with it. I nodded, although the idea of facing Dona Carmen terrified me. I know. But will they believe us? It's been months, I have no proof. I believe you, Carlos said firmly. And we will fight together for justice. I will not let him hurt you again. At that moment, Carlos's phone rang. He looked at the screen and his face darkened. It's her, he said. My mother. I felt like a bucket of cold water had been poured on me. The reality of the situation hit me suddenly. This wasn't over. The real battle was just beginning. Carlos answered the call, putting it on speaker. Hello, Mom, he said, with a controlled voice that revealed nothing of the emotional storm he was experiencing. Carlos, son, Dona Carmen's voice sounded worried. How are you? I wanted to know if you had heard from Anna. The hypocrisy in his voice turned my stomach. Carlos looked at me, seeking my approval. I nodded slightly. Actually, yes, Mom, Carlos said. Anna is back. There was silence on the other end of the line. I could imagine the shocked expression on Dona Carmen's face. What? How? Where was I? His voice trembled slightly. That's what we'd like to know, Mom, Carlos responded, his voice now cold as ice. Why don't you come and explain it to us? Another silence. When Dona Carmen spoke again, her voice had lost all pretense of concern. I don't know what you're talking about, Carlos. I'm glad Anna's back, but... Enough of the lies, Mom, Carlos interrupted her. We know everything. The coffee, the poison, everything. Come here right now or we'll go straight to the police. The call was cut off abruptly. Carlos and I looked at each other, knowing that the final confrontation was about to occur. The next 40 minutes were the most tense of my life. Carlos and I sat in silence, waiting. Every noise on the stairs made us jump. Finally, the doorbell rang. Carlos got up to open the door. I stayed on the couch, feeling like my heart was going to jump out of my chest. And then, there she was. Donna Carmen entered the room, her usual composure completely gone. He looked at Carlos and me, and I knew he understood that his game was over. "Why, Mom?" Carlos's voice was full of pain and disappointment. "How could you do this to us?" Donna Carmen collapsed into a chair, all her arrogance gone. I only wanted the best for you, son. She wasn't enough for you, she didn't understand our world, our position. And you decided that poisoning her and making her disappear was the solution? The disbelief in Carlos's voice was palpable. "I didn't want him to disappear," Donna Carmen sobbed. "I just wanted to scare her, make her leave of her own free will. I never thought it would end like this." I stood up, facing the woman who had destroyed my life. And what did I expect to happen? That I would wake up on a train with no money or documentation and just decide not to come back? Donna Carmen looked at me, and for the first time, I saw true remorse in her eyes. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I'm so sorry." But his apologies came too late. 7 months of my life lost, 7 months of suffering for Carlos and me. Nothing could make up for that. "We're going to go to the police," Carlos said firmly. "You're going to confess everything you did." Donna Carmen nodded weakly, defeated. "I will do it. I will accept the consequences of my actions." The next few hours were a whirlwind. The visit to the police station, the statements, the medical examinations to document my condition after months of living on the streets. Donna Carmen confessed everything, corroborating every detail of my story. The sun was setting over Madrid when I arrived at the building where I lived with Carlos. My heart was pounding as I walked up the stairs, each step echoing in the silence of the hallway. Standing at the door of our apartment, I hesitated. What if Carlos no longer lived there? What if he had rebuilt his life in my absence? With trembling hands, I rang the doorbell. The seconds seemed eternal while he waited. Finally, I heard footsteps approaching. The door opened slowly, revealing a young woman I didn't know. "Yeah?" he asked, looking at me curiously. I'm looking for Carlos Martinez," I stammered. "Does he live here?" The woman shook her head. "Sorry, we moved a few months ago. I don't know any Carlos." My heart sank. "Do you know where he moved?" "No, I'm sorry. The real estate agent might know, but..." I nodded, thanked and walked away with unsteady steps. On the landing, I leaned against the wall, fighting back tears. I was back in Madrid, but I felt as lost as in Barcelona. I decided to try the school where I worked. Maybe there they could give me some clue about Carlos's whereabouts. I took the metro to the Chamberí neighborhood, where the school was located. When I arrived, I stopped in front of the gate, observing the empty courtyard and the silent classrooms. It was summer, and the school was closed for vacation. However, I saw light in the principal's office. Gathering courage, I rang the bell at the main entrance. After a few minutes, the door opened and Don Javier, the director, appeared, a man in his 60s with gray hair and thick-framed glasses. His face went from surprise to amazement and then to a mix of relief and concern. "Ana? Is that really you?" "Yes, Don Javier. It's me," I responded with a trembling voice. "For God's sake, come in," he urged me, ushering me into the building. Once in his office, Don Javier offered me a glass of water and looked at me as if he were seeing a ghost. "Ana, you've been missing for months. The police have been looking for you. Your husband. Oh my God, where have you been?" I told him a condensed version of my story, the poisoned coffee, waking up in Barcelona, the months living on the streets. Don Javier listened with a mixture of horror and compassion. "It's an incredible story, Ana," he said when I finished. "You must report this to the police immediately." "I will," I assured. "But first I need to find Carlos. Do you know where I can reach him?" Don Javier hesitated for a moment. "Carlos stopped working a few months ago. The anguish over your disappearance was consuming him. The last time I spoke with him, he mentioned that he was moving to his parents' house in Alcalá de Henares." Alcalá de Henares. Carlos's hometown, and his mother. A shiver ran down my spine at the thought of facing Dona Carmen. "Thank you, Don Javier," I said, standing up. "It has been a great help to me." "Ana, wait," he stopped me. "Do you need money? A place to stay?" I shook my head. "I'll be fine. I need to figure this out." I left school with a clear purpose, to go to Alcalá de Henares and confront Dona Carmen. I took the commuter train, and during the ride, my mind didn't stop spinning. How would Carlos react when he saw me? Would you believe my story? And most importantly, how would I confront the woman who had tried to destroy my life? I arrived in Alcalá when it was already dark. The cobblestone streets and historic buildings, which would normally have marveled me, now seemed menacing and gloomy. I walked through the familiar streets until I reached Carlos's parents' house, a two-story house in a quiet residential area. I stood in front of the door, my heart beating so hard it felt like it was going to burst out of my chest. I took a deep breath and rang the doorbell. The seconds seemed eternal until I heard footsteps approaching. The door opened, and there she was. Mrs. Carmen. Her face, normally impeccably made up, showed signs of tiredness and worry. When he saw me, his eyes opened wide, and his mouth formed a perfect "oh" of surprise. "You, how is this possible?" he stammered, taking a step back. Without giving him time to react, I entered the house. "Where is Carlos?" I demanded to know. He's not here," Dona Carmen responded, regaining some of her composure. "Ana, what are you doing here? We all thought you were dead." I completed the sentence for her. "That's what you wanted, right? When you gave me that poisoned coffee." The color left Dona Carmen's face. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said, but her trembling voice betrayed her. "You know exactly what I'm talking about," I insisted, taking a step towards her. "You drugged me and put me on a train to Barcelona. Why? Did you hate me that much?" Dona Carmen dropped into an armchair, as if the weight of her actions had finally overcome her. I just wanted the best for Carlos," he began to say, his voice barely above a whisper. "You weren't enough for him. I thought that if you disappeared, in time, he would find someone more suitable." His confession, said so coldly, took my breath away. "How could you? I'm a human being, not an obstacle you can just remove." "I didn't think. I didn't want you to end up on the street," Dona Carmen continued, tears beginning to fall down her cheeks. "I just wanted you to go away, to start a new life somewhere else. And it didn't occur to you that I had a life here? That I loved Carlos and that he loved me?" Just then, we heard the front door open. We both turned to see Carlos enter the room. He froze when he saw me, as if he were seeing a ghost. "And," he whispered, his voice cracking with emotion. "Carlos," I responded, feeling tears begin to fall down my cheeks. In 2 strides, Carlos crossed the room and wrapped me in his arms. I clung to him like my life depended on it, inhaling his familiar scent, feeling his heartbeat against my chest. "I thought I lost you," Carlos murmured between sobs. "I looked everywhere for you. Where have you been?" Before he could respond, Dona Carmen stood up. "Carlos, son." Carlos separated slightly from me and looked at his mother. "You what, Mom?" I was responsible for Anna's disappearance," Dona Carmen confessed, her voice barely audible. Carlos's face went from confusion to horror to anger. "What are you saying? Over the next hour, through tears and accusations, the whole truth came to light. I told Carlos about the poisoned coffee, my awakening in Barcelona, the months living on the streets. Dona Carmen, for her part, admitted her plan to separate me from Carlos, although she insisted that she never wanted to cause me real harm. Carlos listened to everything in silence, his face a mask of pain and betrayal. When we finished, he turned to his mother. "How could you do this to us?" he asked, his voice shaking with suppressed rage. "Do you have any idea of the hell I've been through these past few months? Of the damage you've caused Ana?" "I'm sorry," Dona Carmen sobbed. "I'm so sorry. I just wanted—" "No," Carlos interrupted her. "There is no excuse for what you have done. This is unforgivable." He turned to me, taking my hands in his. "Ana, forgive me. I should have been suspicious, I should have." "It's not your fault," I assured him, squeezing his hands. "You couldn't have known." Carlos nodded, and then, with determination in his voice, said, "We are going to report this to the police. My mother has to answer for her actions." Dona Carmen let out a moan of anguish, but said nothing more. He knew there was no way to justify what he had done. The next few hours were a whirlwind of activity. We went to the police station, where I spent hours telling my story to the officers. Dona Carmen was arrested and taken to testify. Carlos was by my side at all times, holding my hand and offering me his silent support. When we finally left the police station, the sun was beginning to rise over the horizon. Carlos took me to a small hotel nearby, insisting that I needed to rest. In the hotel room, sitting on the bed, Carlos looked at me with a mixture of love and pain. "Ana, I can't even imagine what you've been through. I want you to know that I love you more than ever and that I will do everything I can to help you get through this." The tears came back to my eyes. "I've missed you so much, Carlos. There were times when I thought I would never see you again." We hugged each other in silence, letting the reality of our reunion sink in. I knew we had a long road ahead of us. Dona Carmen's betrayal had left deep scars that would take time to heal. In the following days, we had to face multiple challenges. There were more statements to the police, visits to the doctor to evaluate my health after months on the streets, and long conversations with a therapist to begin processing the trauma. Carlos remained firm in his decision to cut ties with his mother. Despite Dona Carmen's pleas and other family members' attempts at mediation, he remained adamant. "What he did is unforgivable," he repeated over and over again. I, for my part, was torn between rage and compassion. What Dona Carmen had done was terrible, but seeing her now, destroyed by guilt and remorse, made me question whether forgiveness was possible. One afternoon, while Carlos was at work, I decided to visit Dona Carmen in jail where she was being held awaiting trial. When she saw me enter the visiting room, her eyes filled with tears. "Ana," he said with a trembling voice. "I didn't expect to see you here." I sat across from her, separated by a plastic table. "I didn't expect to come either," I admitted. "But I need to understand. I need to know why." Dona Carmen lowered her gaze, unable to hold mine. "I was stupid and selfish," she began. "I have always been very protective of Carlos. When he met you, I saw how he fell madly in love with you, and I was afraid. Afraid of losing him, that he would no longer need me." "That doesn't justify what you did," I said, struggling to stay calm. "I know," she nodded. "Nothing can justify it." In my twisted mind, I thought that if I took you away, Carlos would go back to being the child who depended on me. It was an act of pure selfishness and I am paying the consequences. I have lost my son and I have ruined the life of an innocent person. I saw her there, aged with guilt and remorse, and felt a mixture of contradictory emotions. Part of me wanted to hate her, to scream at her for all the suffering she had caused me. But another part, the part that had survived months on the streets and experienced the kindness of strangers, felt a strange compassion. "I can't forgive you," I finally said. "At least not now." But I hope that one day you can truly understand the damage you have caused and do something to remedy it. Donna Carmen nodded, tears running freely down her cheeks. I understand. And I'm sorry. I'm so sorry, Anna. I left prison feeling strangely light. I hadn't forgiven Donna Carmen, but facing my fears and confronting her had given me a sense of closure that I desperately needed. That night, I told Carlos about my visit. I expected him to get angry, but instead, he hugged me tightly. You're amazing, you know that, he told me. After everything you've been through, you still have the strength to face the person who hurt you. I admire you so much, Anna. The following months were a process of healing and rebuilding. Little by little, I was taking my life back. I returned to teaching school, although now with a new appreciation for the security and stability I previously took for granted. Following my mother-in-law's instructions, I headed towards Alcalá de Henares, a small historic city on the outskirts of Madrid. The train ride from the capital was short, but every minute felt like forever. My heart was pounding, a mix of anxiety and hope taking over me as the cityscape gave way to lower buildings and cobblestone streets. When I got off the train, I stayed on the platform for a moment, breathing deeply. The air smelled different here, cleaner, with a hint of history in every breath. I closed my eyes for a moment, remembering the times Carlos and I had visited this city, walking through its streets full of students, admiring the architecture of the university. I never imagined I would return under these circumstances. With trembling steps, I left the station and entered the streets of the old town. Donna Carmen had told me that Carlos was staying in a small apartment near the Plaza de Cervantes. As it progressed, memories of our previous visits mixed with current reality, creating a sense of surreal déjà vu. Finally, I arrived at the square. The monument to Cervantes stood in the center, imposing as always. My eyes scanned the place, looking for the building that Donna Carmen had described. I found it on a corner, a 3-story building with wrought iron balconies and pots overflowing with red geraniums. I stood there, motionless, staring at the second-floor windows. Would Carlos be in there? How would he react when he saw me? 1,000 questions crowded through my mind, paralyzing me. That's when I saw him. Carlos left the building, with his hands in his pockets and a lost look. He had several days' worth of beard and his clothes, although clean, looked wrinkled, as if he had slept in them. He walked with slow, almost shuffling steps, completely oblivious to his surroundings. My heart skipped a beat. I wanted to scream his name, to run towards him, but my voice refused to come out and my legs felt like lead. I watched him walk away to a nearby bench, where he sat down, taking a book out of his jacket pocket. I took a deep breath, mustering all the courage I had accumulated during my months of survival in Barcelona. It was now or never. With trembling steps, I approached the bench. Carlos, I managed to say, my voice barely audible. He looked up from his book, and our eyes met. I saw his eyes widen, a mix of disbelief, joy, and fear reflecting in them. The book fell from his hands, forgotten on the floor. Anna, he whispered, as if he was afraid that by saying my name out loud, I would disappear. Is that you? Is it really you? I nodded, unable to speak, tears running freely down my cheeks. Carlos stood up slowly, as if in a trance, and took a step towards me. Then another. And suddenly, we were running towards each other. We merged into a desperate embrace, sobbing and laughing at the same time. Carlos pressed me against him as if he feared I was going to faint at any moment. I buried my face in his chest, inhaling his familiar scent, feeling all the broken pieces of my being begin to come together again. You're alive, Carlos repeated between sobs. You're alive. My God, you're alive. I don't know how long we stayed like that, hugging in the middle of the square, oblivious to the curious glances of passers-by. When we finally separated, although without completely letting go, Carlos took my face in his hands, examining me as if he wanted to memorize every detail. Where have you been? He asked, his voice a mix of relief and distress. I looked for you everywhere. The police, the hospitals. I thought I had lost you forever. The words came out of me like a torrent. I told him everything, the poisoned coffee, the awakening on the train, the months in Barcelona. Carlos listened with an expression of growing horror, his hands squeezing mine tightly. My mother. Did my mother do this to you? He asked incredulously when I finished my story. I nodded, watching the disbelief on his face give way to anger. I'm sorry, Carlos. I know it's hard to believe, but... I believe you, he interrupted, his voice firm. I believe you, Anna. I know my mother. I always knew she despised you, but this is unforgivable. We sat on the bench, our hands intertwined, unable to separate ourselves for even a moment. Carlos told me what his life had been like during my absence, the initial desperation, the endless searches, the sleepless nights. He told me about how, little by little, hope had faded, until finally he couldn't bear to live in our apartment, surrounded by memories. I came here to escape, he told me, looking around. But I saw you in every corner, Anna. In every book in the library, in every square, in every sunset. His words moved me deeply. Despite the distance and time, our love had survived. However, I knew we had a long road ahead of us. 7 months of separation and trauma don't go away overnight. What do we do now? I asked, feeling for the first time in a long time that I had a future ahead of me. Carlos squeezed my hand. Now, let's go home. Our house in Madrid. And then we will face this together. Step by step. We gathered Carlos's few belongings from his temporary apartment and took the next train to Madrid. During the trip, we didn't stop talking. There was so much to tell, so much to process. Carlos updated me on our friends, on how everyone had gone out of their way to find me. He told me about his job, about how he had taken a leave of absence to dedicate himself to finding me. Upon arriving in Madrid, the reality of what awaited us fell on us like a stone. We had to face Dona Carmen, deal with the police, explain my disappearance and reappearance. The task seemed overwhelming. Our first stop was the police station. We spent hours there, telling my story over and over again. The police officers listened with a mixture of skepticism and amazement. Finally, after verifying my identity and taking my statement, they let us go, but not before warning us that there would be a thorough investigation. We left the police station emotionally and physically exhausted. Carlos suggested we go home to rest before facing his mother, but I knew I couldn't relax until that chapter was closed. I need to confront her, I said. I need to look her in the eyes and hear why she did it. Carlos nodded, understanding. I will be with you every step, he promised. The trip to Dona Carmen's house was tense. Carlos drove in silence, his jaw clenched, his knuckles white from the strength with which he gripped the steering wheel. I looked out the window, reliving in my mind the day it all began. When we arrived, Carlos had to help me out of the car. My legs were shaking so much I could barely stand. We walked together to the door, and Carlos rang the bell. The seconds it took Dona Carmen to open seemed like an eternity to me. When the door finally opened, my mother-in-law's face went from shock to terror in a matter of seconds. Carlos, he stammered, ignoring me completely. That. Hello, Mom, Carlos said, his voice cold as ice. I think we have a lot to talk about. We enter the house, the air thick with tension. Dona Carmen moved like a cornered animal, her eyes darting from Carlos to me and back again. How could you? Carlos asked, breaking the silence. How could you do this to Anna? To me? Dona Carmen collapsed in an armchair, sobbing. I'm sorry, he repeated over and over again. I'm so sorry. I just wanted to protect you, Carlos. She wasn't good for you. I didn't think. You didn't think what? I interrupted, finding my voice. Did you not think he could survive? That he could come back? Or did you not think about the damage you would do to your own son? My words seemed to hit her like slaps. Donna Carmen looked up, her eyes full of tears and remorse. I only wanted the best for my son. I thought that if you disappeared, he would find someone better, someone from our class. I didn't realize. I didn't want to see how much he loved you. Carlos let out a bitter laugh. And you thought drugging her and abandoning her on a train was the solution? What kind of monster are you, Mom? The silence that followed was deafening. Donna Carmen seemed to have aged 10 years in a matter of minutes. Her arrogance, her haughty bearing, everything had disappeared, leaving only a broken and regretful woman. I'm going to turn myself into the police, he finally said. I will accept the consequences of my actions. I just hope that one day you can forgive me. Carlos and I look at each other. Forgiveness seemed like a distant, almost unattainable concept at the time. But we knew that hate and resentment would only destroy ourselves. Forgiveness will take time, I finally said. A long time. But for now, the important thing is that the truth comes to light. We left Donna Carmen's house feeling exhausted but, somehow, lighter. The road to healing would be long and difficult, but at least now we could see it in front of us. The next few days were a whirlwind of activity. There were more visits to the police, statements to sign, medical tests to take. The story of my disappearance and reappearance was leaked to the press, and we suddenly found ourselves hounded by journalists hungry for lurid details. We decided to get away from the media bustle and took refuge in a small town in the mountains of Madrid. There, surrounded by nature and tranquility, we began the arduous process of rebuilding our lives together. It wasn't easy. We had both changed during those 7 months. I struggled with recurring nightmares and panic attacks, after effects of my time on the streets. Carlos, for his part, had to deal with the guilt of not having found me sooner and the betrayal of his own mother. We started therapy, both individual and couples. Little by little, we unearthed the traumas, faced them and began to heal. We learned to communicate again, to trust each other and ourselves. There were difficult times, nights when the past seemed too heavy to bear. But there were also moments of light, the first time I laughed without reservation again, the day Carlos was able to talk about his mother without anger clouding his voice, the morning we woke up and realized that we had slept all night, no nightmares. As the months passed, our relationship grew stronger. The love that had brought us together from the beginning was still there, but now it was tempered by adversity, stronger and more resilient than ever. We decided not to return to our old apartment in Madrid. There were too many painful memories there. Instead, we bought a small house on the outskirts, with a garden where we could grow our own vegetables. It was a new beginning, a place where we could make new memories. Donna Carmen's trial was a difficult but necessary chapter. Seeing her sitting in the dock, aged and emaciated, was a surreal experience. Despite the damage she had caused us, we couldn't help but feel a tinge of pity for her. When it was time to testify, I looked into Donna Carmen's eyes and saw genuine repentance in them. It didn't justify his actions, but at least it allowed me to begin to let go of some of the resentment I had been carrying. The judge sentenced her to several years in prison, but with the possibility of parole for good behavior. Carlos and I decided that once she got out, we would try to rebuild some kind of relationship with her. Not for her, but for ourselves, to be able to completely close that chapter of our lives. A year after my return, Carlos and I renewed our wedding vows. It was an intimate ceremony, only with our closest friends. When we exchanged rings, I felt like we were sealing not only our love, but also our ability to overcome any adversity together.